Hello, this is Andrew. I've arrived now.
Okay, welcome, Andrew. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the second breakout session. And here you can ask Andrew Nevin any question you have as relating his session. Thank you, Mr. Andrew. That was a very insightful section you had. It was very, very eye-opening and interesting. So
Thank you.
everyone, you can put your questions in the chat room. Any question you have for Andrew Nevin, you can put that in the chat room so he can see. We have 15 minutes for this session before we go back to the main room for our conclusive and concluding part of this event. Yeah, so first off, I would just I would start literally with the question we have, which is first there were MDGs, now there are SDGs. So what is next?
Well, I think that from my perspective, a little bit like the talk. I mean, I think the SDGs are have been well constructed, and I think a lot of them lend themselves to quite precise measurements. So, if the talk I gave said we try to measure GDP, and actually one of the issues with GDP is it's not a very precise measurement. I mean, there's all sorts of methodological issues and problems to try to take all the goods and services and then translate them into a single number. One of the reasons that we stick to it is because it is a single number, but it isn't enough to really drive, as I said, kind of well-being. I think what's going to happen with the SDGs, at least in my hope, is that we start to have better metrics. So I've been encouraging Lagos, for example, let's start to let's start to measure. So when we say no poverty, all right, we understand that at a conceptual level, but we need to translate that into a measurement. And then that measurement and other measurements, good quality education, access to water and sanitation, those measurements need to be published more widely than GDP, and they need to be done by sort of semi-independent groups on that. But I think that we'll find over the next few years that there is a lot of progress in how we measure these things and put the numbers on it. I mean, one of the hopeful signs, for example, is in Lagos, the governor has a brilliant special assistant for SDG goals. So people recognize that this is really a great language. And I think it's up to all of us to help fill the language out so that it drives policymaking. And I'd like to see a day when we don't even really worry much about GDP or measure much of GDP. What we're concerned about is the measurable outcomes on things that really matter.
So true. Yeah. Because that helped in highlighting the fact that when you highlighted how we would move towards the SDGs as against our GDPs, it just helped. It just seemed like everything became easier when we focus on education. For example, the breakdown in the health sector we have now just goes to show that we had a lot lacking in that sector. So if we had focused on that, for a long time, I'm sure that we'll get results, by now. So
yeah, I mean,
who has questions? Okay, sorry, don't say.
No, if people aren't typing questions, I can keep talking a little bit. I mean, particularly the Nigerian situation, I think it's quite critical because, I mean, if we go back to the period 2010 to 2014, we had very big GDP numbers, GDP growth. People lauded the economy. But I mean, the reality was, one, that the GDP growth was largely squandered in consumption terms. I mean, I think people are aware that, for example, in that period, Nigeria was the biggest importer of champagne. And two, the growth was widely skewed. I mean, there was really very little impact on the average Nigerian's life in that period of time. So people around the world, business people, government people, World Bank, all said what a fantastic job Nigeria was doing with these big GDP numbers. But it was in fact not true. So that's why it's so critical we kind of make this transition in our lens. And I don't even like standing up, to be honest, and using GDP, but I'm forced to it in my role because we don't have yet a better alternative. But I think what's interesting historically is, what's one of the reasons this all came around. So to begin with, most of the economics we use was really driven by American economists back, in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, 80s. And so that's really skewed because, of course, the U.S. economy after the Second World War was 50% of industrial production, and the U.S. kind of had this unrivaled power. I mean, obviously, the Soviet Union, no one on this call is old enough to remember that, but the Soviet Union was also powerful. But in terms of kind of the free world, if we'll call it that, American ideology really dominated. But if you go look at what happened in the United States, there was actually a pretty good correlation between GDP and well-being up until the mid-'80s. So of course, the economists who were developing how we do these things kind of took that as an assumption that would always be true. But starting in the mid-'80s, that relationship really broke down. So we had GDP growth. We had actually going backwards in a lot of metrics on well-being. And it's that we kind of need to keep challenging, and particularly from developing nations. So. Oh no, Deborah, you've frozen. Are there any questions? Deborah, can you hear me? Oh no, Deborah's. Deborah,
I can hear
Deborah.
you.
Okay.
Oh,
sorry.
can you hear me now?
Yes, there you go. You've started up
Yes.
again.
Yes.
Any questions?
Yes, we have a new question in from Noah Olaibi, and he's asking that how do we in Nigeria effectively monitor our performance with respect to the SDGs?
Yeah, so I think that's a very interesting question. So let me talk about this at the macro and then the micro level. I actually think that that groups I think Nigeria or an individual state should actually ask outside groups to do the monitoring, and send a lot of credibility that said we're not. I mean, if you look at, we're on Chatham House rules. I hope I'm not here to criticize the Nigerian government, but you saw, those of you who follow events in Nigeria might have seen the last 24 hours. A statement was put out by the presidency on how much progress they've made in the last 5 years and some of their programs and Empower and agriculture, et cetera. And I'm not here to criticize things. I don't have a positive view, but I have said over the years, we need to be honest about what's actually happening, and the government scoring itself on these issues is not helpful, and it's really not credible. I don't think that the government, I won't comment on, say, security or corruption matters, but on the economic matters, which is one of the 3 pillars, I think a lot of people, including myself, would say, look, when you've stood up and said how well you've done, it's just not accurate. When you look at obviously basic GDP, but also all the outcomes I talked about, and unemployment, et cetera. So please don't put out these numbers or the story narrative that tries to say what, it just hurts your credibility because it makes it sound as though you don't understand, the real challenges there. So my counsel would be, if you say Governor Sanwo-Olu in Lagos say, okay, we're going to take 4 or 5 of the GDP of the Sustainable Development Goals, and we're going to get them measured, but we're not going to measure them. We're going to ask an outside group to do it. I mean, I'm sure lots of groups, it would be World Bank or someone similar, would be prepared to do it for no cost to Lagos, and give an outside group the ability to measure the outcome. And then you have a lot of credibility. 1, that we were really pursuing it. 2, that the numbers were really accurate, or as accurate as they can be in our circumstances. But I said I would mention something at the micro level. A lot of money in the world is going to move to fulfill Sustainable Development Goals. There's already something called SDG financing, and what people around the world are prepared to pay for are outcomes. So if you can show a measurable outcome, you'll get financed. And I think a lot of the things that we want to have happen, whether it's around employment or agriculture or sanitation, et cetera, to get the financing we need into Lagos and Nigeria, we're going to have to rely on this SDG type of financing. And then again, you have to have you don't measure it yourself. You have an external group that goes out and measure it. So I think we bring a lot more credibility if we developed a framework for SDG monitoring that had outsiders doing the monitoring.
Okay. Yeah, that's very insightful. On to the next one from Godwin Henry. Across countries, especially in Africa, are we not seeing the needed financial investment to achieve the SDGs?
Yeah, so I think that, so our view, I mean, Yeah, that's a very good question. So we are really the ones maybe 5 years ago, when I was forced to become the economist, we were the first ones that really talked about the fact that it was impossible in GDP terms to grow faster because there was not enough investment in Nigeria. And then we've also said, look, it's not as though we need all this investment from outsiders. There's really three rings of the circle here. I mean, to begin with, Nigerians need to invest in Nigeria. I'll come back to that in a moment. Secondly, the diaspora needs to invest in Nigeria and Africa. And thirdly, if Nigerians and the diaspora invest, then others will invest. Now, to go back to Nigeria, I mean, there's an enormous amount of capital that's in Nigeria, but it's to use the term coined by the great Professor De Soto in Peru, it's dead capital, dead, not debt, dead capital. And Astor talked about this too. She referred to all of this as how do you unlock the capital? I mean, most of the dead capital in Nigeria is tied up in real estate. And I own my own house in Lagos. I pay my own, I pay for myself. I'm not an expat. I mean, it's very difficult to conduct the transaction. So someone who, say, has a piece of land that they want to sell so they can open up another business finds it very difficult, and that capital becomes dead. So the number one way to start getting more investment in Nigeria is to unlock the dead capital first, because it's just sitting there. And of course, as I said, most of it's real estate, so you have issues around the Land Use Act, about the mortgage system. And I think now, and then we wrote, of course, PwC Nigeria wrote the paper about it last year, I think, which had a big impact. But that is the starting point for this. I mean, we have more than enough capital tied down in Nigeria. And once people in Nigeria are prepared to invest in Nigeria and make longer term capital investments, then the diaspora will do the same, and then outsiders will do the same. But I think it's a mistake for us to trot around the world asking outsiders to invest in Nigeria if Nigerians are not prepared to invest.
Yeah. So I would quickly ask this from Olumide Adelakun, and he's asking that how can businesses reposition post COVID-19?
Well, I think that I mean, to begin with, we all understand that businesses need to be more digitally savvy. So my own clients, I mean, I'm not full-time economist. I serve my clients mainly, and my own clients are in the financial services, so banks and stock exchange, investment banks, insurance companies, and they obviously need to become much more digitally enabled, et cetera. But I do think in Nigeria, COVID-19 is going to open up a lot of opportunities for people that are innovative in two areas. One of course, is obvious, is healthcare. I mean, this COVID-19 crisis has shown, I mean, the healthcare system has not been developed. Of course, the wealthy in Nigeria always fled to have their healthcare delivered in Dubai or London, and found out that wasn't possible. But I think that the demand for quality healthcare at an affordable price is now going to become unstoppable. And I think the people that can develop businesses and deliver the healthcare are going to build something really important. But the thing about the healthcare is that you need to be clever. It's partially digital, and of course, healthcare is always physical. So I think that there's going to have to be quite a lot of innovation in the way healthcare is delivered, but still keeping the physical touch. And I think if you go back to the way it was say developed in Canada, we need to leapfrog that. I mean, the Canadian system, like the UK or Sweden, is basically based on the physical model: 500 people per physician, one specialist, one GP, a certain number of nurses, etc. All of that is not, we cannot build it fast enough, the infrastructure, and we'll never reach the number of people if we do the mathematics. So we need to combine technology to augment it, but not replace the physical touch. I think a second area there's going to be a lot of innovation is education. And again, I'm not a huge advocate of 100% online education. I mean, I think sessions like today we had are fantastic, but there's a limit to doing all these virtual sessions, and it works well for groups that already know each other, but not necessarily for starting new school years. So I think people are going to find innovative ways to deliver education in Nigeria at a reasonable cost, combining some digital elements and some physical elements. And just the third area in terms of change. I need to say, which I've been talking a lot about from my economics perspective in Nigeria, is just a fiscal restructuring. So those of you who follow this closely will see some of the dire numbers coming out of the federal government, 5.5 trillion deficit. I mean, the federal government is under enormous pressure, and the states are effectively, with oil at $35, going to be insolvent. I'm not sure in June, for example, how many states will be able to meet their salary requirements now that the third low oil price has started to roll through. Is it time?
No, I'm listening.
Okay, sorry. So I think that what's going to happen in Nigeria is a lot of things that we've talked about in terms of making it easier to do business and employment. They're happening automatically, not because the federal government wanted them to, but because they were forced to. So issues like the fuel subsidy, but the particularly important one is electricity right now. So I mean, I don't need to belabor what's going on, but there's this very critical committee that's chaired by Governor El-Rufai from Kaduna, and we're big fans of Governor El-Rufai. I think he's done lots of great things in his state, and he's headed this commission, which has federal members and obviously state members, and I think they're going to come up with some quite radical changes to the way electricity is managed in the country, particularly around decentralization. I mean, just telling states they need to get on with it. And in our environment, where you have a lot of competing technologies and the potential for renewables, in many ways, it's going to be much easier to solve the electricity issue at the local level than at the national level. So I think all of these things mean, really, the term we've been using is a forced restructuring, where Nigeria federal government is going to, in a certain sense, lose control of the economic narrative, and states are going to have to step up. And many of them have been, but will be sort of empowered more to step up, because the federal government won't have the resources to keep the structures in place. And part of it too is also the whole FX regime, because of course, to the extent that the CBN has controlled or managed the exchange rate and the FX regime, it's only because it has a flow of dollars. But when oil price is only $35, then it's not really, I mean, the CBN doesn't have dollars, right? Because the cost of producing the oil is almost as high. And if they don't have dollars, they won't be able to control it. So I think all of these things point to a major shift in kind of economic management of the country, which I hope is for the positive. But if I had to use a historical analogy, I would, in India, they had major crisis in 1992, and they had to airlift all their gold to get an, sadly, IMF loan as collateral for an IMF loan. But the net result was that was really the takeoff in the Indian economy and reduction in poverty, and particularly around IT outsourcing and business service outsourcing that really drove the economy for a long time. So I'm optimistic that we're in a difficult period, but I think we're going to come out of it stronger. And I'm a big believer in the strength of the states. You look at every state and just the potential they have, and if they could just get on with it, we'd have a fantastic, inclusive, strong SDG delivering country.
Yeah, beautiful. I think we'll just round up with this question before we wrap up the breakout session. And that's asking, the question is, are you optimistic that innovation in Africa is likely to catch up with developing nations, and that our innovations will make us more self-reliant?
Yeah, so I think, I mean, that's a very good question, and the short answer is yes. I'm very optimistic, and I mean, I have to stand up and give so much bad news so much of the time, and people ask me, "Come on, Andrew, why are you, are you pessimistic?" But I mean, the thing is, even like the events today, every day I run into young Nigerians, young Africans trying to do amazing things, who just the sheer courage they have to take something on this big with limited resources, and you have many of these projects will fail, but some will succeed, and they're all important as part of the process. And I just, as I said, I see these every day, people trying to make a huge difference. And I'm a big believer in combining technology in the physical world and the African context, and only young Africans are going to figure this out. So when I look at ag tech, clean tech, ed tech, health tech, as I talked about, obviously fintech, all of these things. I see young Nigerians and young Africans trying to solve these problems. So they're going to figure it out. I don't have a lot of faith, not that I'm critical, but when I look at outside institutions or people in Europe trying to figure it out, I don't think they're going to sort it out. But there's enough talent in Africa. So I am very optimistic. And I think it's a little bit like a flywheel, pushing, pushing, pushing. And then once it breaks, you know, it is breaking already. I mean, Lagos is the biggest innovation center for small scale solar in the world. There's so many different experiments and people trying different things, but so many people trying different things in agriculture in Nigeria. So no, I'm very optimistic. And I myself am committed to it. I have 2 startups that I co-founded, maybe 3 soon. You know, I'm very interested in seeing something, you know, what's going on in ed tech, health tech. People know that I will read anything on LinkedIn. I will read any young person sending an idea and at least trying to give my opinion. So I'm very optimistic, and I'm not going anywhere. I'm looking forward to getting back as soon as I can.
Great. That's so beautiful. Thank you so much, so for this session. It was very insightful and it was interesting. I would like to redirect everyone back to the main event where we would conclude this great event we have. So there's a link that I dropped now in the chat room where we can all use to redirect back to the main room. Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Andrew, once again.
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah.
See you in a minute, the other room.
Yeah.